So it was funny because that we were just talking about that. So when I finished your book, one of the first of all, let's show that thing real quick. You know what I'm saying? Just let people know.
You know, giveaway tonight. Giveaway tonight. Might have to change the time because someone wants to do another interview with me at the time the show is going to be on. So we might have to change that time. Might be moving back, might be moving forward. But I will be on the ITR stream later tonight. So,
Not a
talk to me. I talk back.
not a bad thing to be a man in demand. But so when I finished the book, one of the first comparisons I made in my mind was there's a book that maybe you even know. It's called Everything You Need to Know About the Music Business.
Never
And
heard of it.
so it's kind of like the music industry's version of what you're doing here in a sense, where it's kind of breaking down some of the facets and some of the basics on how that industry is put together. Just I guess give like a brief summary or a gist on what this book is and what the objectives are and like what you're trying to communicate.
I mean, this is kind of like I was in the gym shooting Kevin Montano last night, and it's like anyone that knows me knows I'd much rather shoot a developing fighter who nobody's showing love to keep them in the gym and keep them chasing a dream. That gets me more motivated than going out and going to a media day or anything like, oh man, there's 50 media people. Here's elite athlete guy and he's there. The point of this book, which is what everyone always asks me, they go, I heard you wrote a book. Is it doing good? And I'm like, yeah, it's selling surprisingly better than I thought. And people are like being nice. And I haven't got criticism yet. I will get criticism because that's inevitable, right? Someone's going to go, well, who say something negative at some point, but kind of shocking that people haven't. But I think the major focus is boxing is a sport of use and abuse. It's overpromise and underdeliver, right? That's the theme of this book is a lot of times people overpromise and underdeliver. And because of that, I'd like to give people a roadmap in boxing. This isn't necessarily like the success formula, but these are things to like always be aware of. These are things to look at. An example, I compare amateur boxing to AAA baseball. If you're not having success as an amateur boxer, yes, you can turn pro, but what are you really doing it for? Are you doing it to walk out at a hotel ballroom in a local regional venue and have your song played? Because those guys that are beating you at the amateur shows, they're turning pro and you're going to have to fight them again. And now it's going to be with smaller gloves, not shorter, smaller gloves. And it's actually going to be much harder fights. And I think that accountability is a big thing in this book. This is a book to hold a young person accountable for a lot of stuff in their lives.
Well, yeah, and I think it's as much about the structure of boxing and all of the different moving parts, but it's also a book about relationships ultimately. Like the key component or like the greatest currency in boxing is relationships. It's who's your cut man, who's your promoter, who's your manager, who are all of these people and do they ultimately kind of have your best interest in mind?
Well, and I think that it's also like that's a great place of putting it, but it's also about just thinking about things that you might not think about, right? Because I'd say 90 to 95% of all boxing people who come into the sport of boxing who are pro boxers, each paycheck matters. So they're going to want to stretch each check. And the concept of getting $10,000, but half of it goes to my team and I have to pay taxes on it. And I'm actually making the lowest amount when it comes to looking at that big check that's 10,000. I might walk away with $3,000 knowing I saved some for taxes, knowing I took care of everyone. It's a radical idea because boxers often aren't thinking from the lens of I'm my own company, I'm my own business. When you're your own business, you're often, if you're the boss, you're getting paid the lowest salary until it's successful because part of your obligation is to fulfill the obligations that you bring people on to pay. That's part of being a leader. That's why I bring up people like Ernest Shackleton in this book, right? Ernest Shackleton's a very important person. I didn't bring up Lyndon B. Johnson, but LBJ in this office that I'm working from, I have a lot of the Caro books. He has 4 books on LBJ, and it's like, what is LBJ really about? LBJ is about how could he navigate a political system to get what he wanted. He was a Machiavellian president. He felt that it wasn't really about who he was. It was about clarifying the ends to the means that he wished to achieve as a president. So I say all that to say boxing is a lot like politics, and it's a lot like Machiavelli's The Prince, where it's a lot of political lenience and power brokering. It's not as much a business. I don't think any business person would come into boxing and go, man, this is a well structured Fortune 500 company. It's about managing and dealing with relationships and leadership capacities.
That's um that's really dense. That's really dense. It's a boxing as a business concept. If you came in and you looked at it, we've talked about the burning building getting looted a million times. It's like the only real comparison where there's shit to be had. Everyone's kind of scrambling to get what they can get. You know what I'm saying? But if you can meet those people that are like calm in the fire and have the collective interest of you and your team, like that really is like the most important thing I think that I took out of it.
Good, like I mean, I wrote the book. It's been received well, but I never know how people are going to receive the book because when I reread the book, I get an interpretation each and every time different where like when I read the first page, it's like, okay, like because I put in one of my favorite quotes from Harry S. Truman where it says if you want a friend, buy a dog. And that's more
Right.
true than like in boxing. Like if you want a friend and you're coming into boxing to make a friend, you probably will make a friend, but it's better just to go to Petco or one of these pet stores and buy a dog because that's going to be a much better, healthier relationship. Boxing has been like for most of my life an abusive relationship, and now it's working towards being a healthy relationship. This is not the sport to find yourself as a person if you don't have the right people. It's a great thing that can build self confidence. It's a great thing, I think, to teach discipline. But if you enter it as a business and you haven't figured out some of these unanswered questions in your own life, it's just going to make everything more difficult because the level of poverty and the pay structure is rough. The only a select few get a substantial earnable living from this sport. And this book is kind of, in my opinion, the raw truth. Like, I'm not selling anybody a dream. This book is, I think, mainly written for 8 to 22-year-olds or parents of 8 to 22-year-olds or people in the boxing industry who want to say, that's kind of true. That's kind of true. They might chuckle and say, that's kind of true. Or it's for a fighter burnt out midway through his career to maybe give them hope. I'm looking at this book as kind of like boxing's Machiavelli's The Prince. And it's kind of funny because that's my favorite book. So it's kind of funny that the first thing I ever published and wrote, um, there are a lot of comparisons, right? It's kind of written like a treatise. And The Prince has a guy who's a prince on the cover. Mine has me in a boxing ring. There's a lot of comparisons unintentionally. So, and I think a big thing to point out too is it's not this different about what I wrote is every chapter ends with questions. I'm
Yep.
not
I
trying to
love
talk
that
your
part.
ear off.
I love
I
that
want
part.
the reader to think, I don't want you just to take my word and go with it. I want you to think about these scenarios. And let's not forget there's a lot of people that aren't very good readers. So if you can't read like and I made it double spaced, bigger font, so then I didn't want to
Right.
intimidate anyone.
Well, it's like
If it was
here's the
too
information, and then here's some of the things that you're hoping that they reflect on.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, do you know how many people have told me they just jump and read the questions and then they like the questions, so they go back and read a chapter, and before they know it, they read the whole book because they started at the questions and then worked their way back to reading, and then they go piece by piece jumping around, and then all of a sudden they're like, I read the book. And
Yep.
it's like that was the purpose of the questions was I want this to be very accessible to people. I don't want it to be something that's like you have to know a slew of words and all types of things. I don't want to say I dumbed it down, but we went from 200 pages down to 117 pages. That wasn't it hurt my ego. It hurt my ego because I wanted a big fat book. But my girlfriend said, "Are we trying to make the best, most readable thing that's going to impact lives, or do you want to feel good and stick your chest out and say I'm a big author who wrote a 200-page book?"
Hit some
And I
stat.
had to tuck my pride, you know.
Yeah. So, I mean, having known you for a while and we're on podcasts every week and we talk and whatever, I think it's important to ask this because I think it helps kind of it ups the value on what you're providing here because there's a lot of good shit in here. How would you describe if somebody didn't know you or hadn't met you, how would you describe your role or your position in boxing and how you've come to all of this?
I really don't know how to answer that because like okay, I started out which I'm writing in my second book outside of the ropes, right? So I'll start out with what and so I started out I went to school to make videos. Like '08, the financial situation happens and there's no jobs. There's no creative jobs. Social media isn't really a thing, so you can't get a job for a company making those. It literally looked like the Great Depression probably looked, where there were literally signs when I was going places that said no help wanted. You know, you see help wanted. I literally was going places where it said no help needed. And I remember I went to 20 job interviews and it could speak to me, but I got declined at each and every one. And I was going to like ones from my college degree. Then I'd go to like Abercrombie and Fitch to sell clothes. Oh, we don't really like the way I just kept getting rejected. So at that time, I started getting back into boxing because it's like, okay, I'm broke. I think I had like maybe $2,000 in my savings and I was making a little bit of money on the side, just through like kind of projects and this and that that I could pay my rent and do that. But it wasn't like my money was going up in any capacity. So I got back around boxing and then I was going to be like a school counselor. So I'm like, okay, if I go back to school and everyone's broke, that's probably like a good investment. So I'm like, I'll be a school counselor. So working with some people. And then the epiphany moment was it was a weekend and I was going to the bars and I was kind of really unfocused. I kind of cheated myself out of being an athlete when I was young because I didn't really have a focus on anything. So I never got to see how far I could push myself athletically, which is kind of a bummer, but it's something I have to just deal with because, like, in many ways, I have to sit here and smile and just be like, you did it. Like, you chose not to do that. Smile, be proud of that. Like, you never did it. You need to be so grateful you didn't do it because that's what you chose to do. And I really need to embrace that, right? Because I wasn't accountable enough to handle that. I didn't get to where I needed to, and I'm firmly believe I never am not accountable. So I watched Bernard Hopkins versus Chad Dawson, and I paid for it on pay-per-view. And the result was like Chad hit him with a spine buster, and B Hop kind of got the fight stopped, and it was weird. So I wrote a blog post for like some blog thing at the time. I don't even know what it was. And I shared it with like four buddies, and they were like, "You could be a boxing writer." And I was like, "Okay, so how do you do that?" Because nothing else is working. Like I literally was doing everything, and it's like I never heard positive reinforcement. It's like I was making videos. It's like, yeah, that's kind of cool, whatever. So it's like I do this boxing thing, and I heard like three positive things, and it's like I'm going on from like 2001 to like 2010. Like it's like a 20-to-1 ratio of negative to positive. So it's like, this is positive. Okay, let's go in that direction. So then I just started trying to figure out, okay, make a Twitter account, make this, make that, keep up with the fights. And then what I liked was instead of going to the bars or doing dumb stuff, I was like sitting at home to watch a fight. So I had to learn a skill. Through that, went to some fights. Then I started following Don Chargent, Paco Damian cards in Northern California region, befriended some fighters like Andy Venesis and all of them. And when you're a regional writer and cover the sport, you befriend fighters. So then it becomes kind of like an oil executive, right? you don't work in the government, but you probably have deep relationships with politicians where the roles become confusing and the lines blur because it's like I'm covering Andy, but at the same time I've seen him for 5 years, and then when he moves on to Top Rank or Gabriel Flores moves on to Top Rank, and I was covering him when he was 15, you're not going to be objective because you have so much human interest brought into him. You care that deeply about him. So my role in boxing originally was just someone that was observing the sport. But I think what makes me interesting is because I never had a major backing, when I never had someone say, "Oh, this guy's dope. Be sure to read his stuff." I had to really get it out the mud, and I had to go through all these different channels and learn firsthand through an apprenticeship on the road and with the fighters. And I think because of that, my perspective is a lot different. And because of that, I feel like my perspective is more so of a fighter and a coach, more so than a media personality, because I wasn't really embraced by the media. Like no one really was like, okay, let me show you how to be a media guy. And honestly, like a lot of the media people, I just didn't really like the way they talked. Like I didn't relate to the perspectives they had. Like I don't want to sit up here and tell you that boxing's terrible, because that's like going to a restaurant and telling you that the food here is great except for the chicken tenders. Like who wants to eat at a restaurant where you're disparaging the food at the restaurant? So that's basically like, does that sum it up?
Yeah, bro. I mean, that was great. Why do you? I was thinking about this, right? Like boxing's been around forever, man. Why do you think there's never been something done like this before, where there's really somebody that's like explaining how all of this shit works?
I mean, I'm sure someone did something before me. It's just that it either never caught on, or it was never marketed, or it was marketed and caught on, and then at a certain point it died off. But I'm sure someone did this. But I think the main reason is people that would write a book like this get so burnt out by the sport of boxing itself that by the time they're about to write something like this, they'd rather just leave boxing altogether because they feel hurt and abandoned. So I think the real reason is most people that would take time to write a book like this would rather just leave the sport than sit down and give more to the sport.
I guess what's still motivating for you when
The
it,
young fighters, like the young, seeing young people. I mean, I was telling this to Kevin Montano when I shot his video that's going to be up probably around the time this video goes up on ITR, is the main event fights aren't really interesting to me. Like the fights itself aren't interesting. I think like the more I get into boxing, it's like looking at the characters, looking at the journeys of people. Like a guy like Vasil Lomachenko is interesting to me, but his boxing skills are probably the most uninteresting thing about him. You have someone who has this fantastical record, this amazing record, who has this deep relationship with his father, who moved away from his country, who lives in a foreign place, and he's mostly about legacy. Sure, he's been paid well, but it's like most of the Lomachenko thing is he wants to go down as an all-time great. Everything's legacy, legacy, legacy. He gave up some of his purse. Seeing a young fighter like Kevin Montano, Charlie Sheehy, Lorenzo Powell, Kane Sandoval, and seeing them in their infancy going to the gym, maybe that's a special day for them to see me go to the gym, to break up the monotony of their young life, to go and film, to give them some clips that they can be proud of. That's what keeps me going. But going to a major fight to see two millionaires fight and to actually get excited about the outcome, that rarely happens anymore. Like that type of stuff is not what I'm in this sport for. I'm in the sport to see the development of young people and to see how far they can go in the sport. I rarely look at a matchup and go, man, I can't wait to see this fight. Like more often than not, I'll watch the undercard and turn off the main card. I want to see how the young fighters are doing, and then I'll look at the matchups. But what's great is I don't have to watch these main event fights all the time because you kind of can know the outcomes of some fights. I won't spell it out, and I can watch YouTube videos that are 4 to 5 minutes that just give me the highlights. And if I knew the outcome and people aren't texting my phone because everyone texts, I'm boxing guy, right? So all my friends are boxing people. So if nobody's texting my phone saying, hey, turn the fight on, and I have other things to do, like last week, and then the week before, I had stuff to do. I go out and do stuff, but I always make sure I see the young fighters. I always try to support my community, and I always circle back to see the fights. But I'm the first one to tell you that I don't have some deep passion to watch boxing consistently night in, night out.
I guess one of the other things that you brought up in the book too is that like amateur boxing is the real sport, and the professional.
But it's just as corrupt. Like it's just as corrupt. Like let's not act like the head of the IOC didn't get caught for drug dealing. But keep going with your question.
Well, I guess what I was going to ask is there a world, or is there any kind of way where the structure that keeps amateur boxing a sport, can that at all be implemented in professional boxing?
So here's the problem is like the fighters, like the Pro Box TV is doing amateur boxing right now. They have the last chance tournament, last chance dance or whatever they're called, last chance event where guys are fighting Joseph Fernandez, Kendo Tremendo, Michael Dutchover was in it. Guys that sign up for those type of things are either going to be well-paid world champions looking for greatness, or guys who've taken a couple of losses who have their backs against the wall. You're not going to find the middle tier of prospects looking to enter a tournament because they're all smart enough to know in this era a loss devalues you so much. You could go from making 100,000 to 20,000 just off of one loss. And because of that, no one wants to get paid less. So what we have, because a loss hurts your career financially so much, we have people navigating these systems as best as they can. And what does it do as fight fans? Well, it helps the fighters and all of that. But in terms of a sport, it makes for a few fights where you can just kind of pick and choose what fights on the card you want to see, because people are just getting their yearly income and then they're waiting until they have enough financial stability, or they're forced into a fight to put forth the fight that the fans want to see.
So it's, I mean, essentially it's just the the way the money is broken down and the way the structure is broken down, there is no way to enforce something the same way you would in amateur boxing,
Well, I
essentially.
mean, I think the thing is, like in amateur boxing, the boxers are rather helpless. They can't advocate for themselves all that much. And I say that to say, yes, USA Boxing does a great job at hearing out the fighters, and I'm sure in the world level they do. But you have to adhere to certain guidelines. And if you don't adhere to the guidelines, you're done. You can't do it. On a local level in amateur boxing, a guy misses weight a couple of counties over, none of the local promoters will stick together. They'll put that kid on the show. So that's the total anarchy of that, right? So it's like you can see in amateur boxing at the highest level, people, there's some guidelines. At the lowest level, how can we get these as many people on that'll bring people, that'll pay money, that'll drive up revenue for whatever the heck we're trying to do, right? So in pro boxing, beyond that, it's opportunity granters. So you have to find someone that'll grant you an opportunity. And now, whoever that person that grants you an opportunity has to paint their own version of a Picasso. So they're taking your career in their hands, and then whatever they envision as a ideal or a successful career, it's really going to be the manager, the promoter's idea of how to mold you into a finished product. And oftentimes that isn't, hey, let's just see how good this person is compared to these other, because it's, as I said before, oftentimes the fights you want to see, it's four equally powerful brokers of this leverage in the sport. And if it's four powerful people, why would one of them want to give up their power, because said asset would now weaken their ability to have power? And this is a sport of power brokering and having power and leveraging power into money. So the issue is, it's not just the fighters, it's also the distribution of the power in the system where we devalue the fighter so much based on a loss that the whole entity that makes money around them does not want to put them in those fights unless they truly believe their fighter will win every fight.